of education exclusion, which we've heard about already, and poor longer-term outcomes for autistic children and young people by harnessing their very strong interests as manifested in the school environment. So, again, as has been mentioned, the education of children generally, of disabled children, of autistic children, is underpinned by some very important and long-standing rights. For example, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child states that education should be conducive to the child's achieving the fullest possible social integration and individual development. And later we had the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which states, amongst many other things, that disabled children should be able to access education on an equal basis along with other children. And therefore, it's important to provide accommodations and support measures. And these steps are necessary to enable persons with disabilities to participate effectively in a free society, and the ultimate goal is full inclusion. And these international provisions are followed by European laws, national laws and provisions within member states. So we have to ask ourselves, are the rights of autistic children being realised in the school environment? Well, the reality in the UK is in fact that autistic children and young people are subject to high levels of educational exclusion, as Peter mentioned. And this can be exclusion from school on a fixed term basis, or indeed it can be permanent. But there's also an awful lot of exclusion within school. For example, children might be doing a part-time timetable, or they might not have access to after-school clubs. This is a huge problem in the UK. And also, autistic children can be subject to high levels of stress in school, particularly due to the sensory environment, as well as anxiety, perhaps due to social issues. And if they don't receive the support that they need, this in turn can lead to self-exclusion and self-withdrawal from school. And the research that we have shows that autistic children leave school with few or indeed no qualifications, and in adult life they are underemployed. So if they are working and if they do have qualifications, they're working at a lower level than that might suggest, or they might not be working at all when they would like to. And overall, autistic people have very poor health and well-being outcomes in the longer term. So we really have to work harder to try and find ways in which we can improve the experiences of autistic children in school, their inclusion and their longer-term outcomes. So we must find answers to this problem. So to look at the issue of what are also often called special interests or very strong interests, this is a very key autistic trait, and it denotes a tendency to focus on activities or issues or items with a very high degree of intensity. And the DSM-5, which is a diagnostic manual, refers to restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities as being indicative of autism. And generally speaking in the literature, this very key autistic disposition is actually presented quite negatively. And the vocabulary used to describe this disposition is similarly negative. Terms like fixations, obsessions, circumscribed interests, restricted, narrow. And it's also been associated with unwanted repetition, perseveration, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. However, particularly led by the autistic research community, there's been a more positive framing of this trait called monotropism, or an interest model of autism. And interestingly, within educational contexts, the research shows that mainly positive effects are found when the very strong interests of autistic children are supported in school. So to turn to my own study now, so I spent 5 months in 5 mainstream primary schools in England, and I was looking at different aspects of the educational inclusion of the autistic children in those 5 schools. I was also looking at the support that they received, and I also asked all of the adults in my study how they might define or describe autism. And this was a case study design, so this enabled me to gather very rich and detailed data. And my participants consisted of 36 school staff, 10 autistic children who were aged between 4 and 10, 10 parents and 10 autistic adults. And this was a mixed method study, particularly as far as the children are concerned. And all of my data were analysed through a process of thematic coding and thematic analysis and coding. And I ended up with 8 interlinked themes, and some of those themes could be described as a priori themes. In other words, they link fairly obviously to my initial research questions. But others evolved through a more inductive process of data collection and data analysis. I wasn't looking for the issue of interest when I started my research, but I ended up with so much data on it, I couldn't ignore it. Overall in my study, I found that the autistic children were experiencing a number of difficulties in school, most of which had nothing to do with them. Sometimes the support that they received was over-controlling, and so rather than helping them to develop their agency and independence, it had the opposite effect. They had very patchy access to the school curriculum, and there were a lot of conflicting views on what their educational priorities should be. Should they be doing the same curriculum as everybody else, or should they be doing some sort of intervention on communication or socialization? They had very poor access to assessment and tests generally, school exams, and there was a very distinct lack of awareness of the access arrangements which they are entitled to. The support for their communication was sometimes contradictory. Rather than being supported to express their own wishes and views and choices, they were actually being coerced into expressing what the adult wanted to do. Some inclusionary processes were in fact exclusionary, so a child might be sent out of class partway through to take part in some sort of intervention activity. The child was then expected to return to the class to do the same activity in less time, having not received the full explanation. And also, amongst the adults, the understandings of autism were highly varied. And so we have to think about what impact this has on autistic children in school if all the adults around that child have a different view on what autism is. For 5 of the 10 autistic children in my study, there was a very high degree of repetition of tasks, of materials, of instructions issued. And this was also associated with a high level of verbal and physical prompting. In other words, the children didn't want to do these things, so they were having to be constantly prompted. So I'll give you an example with a boy who I've called Piotr, who is age 4. And during a 12-minute activity where he was matching plastic bears on laminated strips, his teaching assistant asked almost identical questions, such as, where does the bear go? And almost identical instructions, 73 and 53 times respectively, during those 12 minutes. And this adds up to 126 questions or instructions. But this wasn't all. She was also using additional physical prompts. She was trying to hold him in place on his chair, on her knee, and she was doing hand over hand. And these scenarios were also linked with a very low degree of task completion. So Piotr never actually finished this activity, and a low level of satisfaction and well-being for the child. So let's compare it now with another example with Piotr, where he's much more engaged and motivated, and he has had some choice. So this was an early handwriting activity, which for him was mark making on whiteboards with felt tip pens. And in a complete reversal of the previous activity, he has got his hand over the hand of the teaching assistant, and he's guiding her to make swirling shapes, which he rather liked. So he is prompting her rather than the other way around. And when she does prompt him, it's more for encouragement. She says, good boy, beautiful. And although Piotr is controlling this activity quite a lot, he's much more compliant than he was during the previous activity when he wasn't being compliant at all. She asked him to wipe the board clean, she asked him to choose another pen, and he does so. And he's also seated willingly next to her. She's not having to force him on his chair. And these scenarios showed a very significant reduction in prompting. In fact, so much so, there was sometimes no prompting at all. And interestingly, these situations when the child was engaged and motivated had a reciprocal enabling impact on the school staff, who showed greater skill and self-efficacy. And understandably, there was also a much better child-adult rapport. When the staff are having to sort of fight with the children all the time to try and get them to do something, it's not very satisfactory for anybody. One teacher who said that when she learned that a particular autistic boy was due to join her class, she was rather worried because she perceived him as being an extreme child. But after he joined her class and she learned that they both shared a very strong interest in Disney films, she said, he's now my absolute favourite child I have ever taught. So a girl who I'll call Lucy, in maths activities and also interviews, she was quite hesitant and taciturn and quite subdued. But she actually loved anything to do with wildlife and nature. And she was very, very different during an activity about snakes. She was looking at a book about snakes. She was very talkative, she was very enthusiastic, she said wow a few times. And she also exhibited a variety of learning aptitudes. She was reading out loud, finding synonyms, asking questions. Does the milk snake drink milk? She was paying attention to detail. She was commenting spontaneously and on request on the text. The sunbeam snake is so shiny. She was relating the book to her own experiences watching films about snakes at home, and she was also carrying out independent silent reading. And so, in fact, she was demonstrating what are called high-level reading skills, which, according to the Department of Education in England, have been linked to positive education, health and employment outcomes in the longer term. And so we see an indicative link here between an autistic child being able to access their interests, better participation and well-being, and potentially at least starting a route towards longer-term outcomes, much better longer-term outcomes. In fact, overall in my study, I found that when the autistic children could access their very strong interests, there were a very significant number of inclusionary benefits. Some of the children were markedly more fluent in their speech when they were talking about what interested them. Their socialization improved mainly because the teaching assistant wasn't so present, and when the teaching assistant faded back, peers were able to approach. Curriculum access to tests in some cases. They were more independent. They showed better motor skills. There was much more intrinsic enjoyment of activities. They weren't having to be prompted all of the time. It was a source of comfort for some of the children when they were experiencing stress in school, and also for some of them it was linked to their future plans and expertise. And as I said, the practitioners were less intrusive in their support, and they showed greater skill. However, there were some drawbacks to this autistic trait as manifested in the school environment. It was in some cases a barrier to learning, a barrier to school tests, and a barrier to socialization. There were far fewer disadvantages than advantages, but there were some disadvantages. So I'll give some examples of that now. Piotr's teacher said that she would love him to spend more time with his class, but she said persuading him to give something a try can be difficult. She said he would spend all day playing with dinosaurs if she let him. Alex's mother said that friendships were absolutely essential to her son's well-being, but she said, I'm hoping he's going to learn that he can't be so selfish. He can't just talk about what he wants to talk about or play with what he wants to play with. One teacher said that an autistic boy in her class was very good at writing, but she was worried about his exams in English because she said his writing was becoming more and more dominated by his preoccupations and obsessions, and he wasn't answering the question. And Michael's teaching assistant said he hates doing work. He likes sitting on the computer and playing CBeebies. CBeebies is a children's channel in the UK. Overall, however, I found that when the autistic children were able to access their very strong interests in the school environment, there was a whole raft of inclusionary benefits. And I also think that the negative effects of this autistic trait as manifested in school could at least in part be explained by the stresses of the school environment. Sometimes the children were resorting to their interests when doing these very repetitive activities, or one or two of them were experiencing bullying. Into adulthood, being able to access and develop interests has been associated with flow, well-being, personal growth, social learning and development. And it's also been linked to the development of expertise, a high level of skill, and even savant abilities. And recent research has shown that these interests are not as narrow or as fixed as previously thought. And so we need to address this negative conceptualization of this very key autistic trait, because autistic people can be pressured to modify, diminish, or even extinguish their interests altogether, particularly if they're thought to be taking up too much time or they're thought to be inappropriate in some way, which is an issue. But this can bring with it a sort of mourning process and can be at the cost of giving up their exceptional abilities. And when this trait has been associated with unwanted repetitive behavior, it's also been linked to concerning practices like restraint and, in the US, electric shock treatment. In the UK, teachers are under pressure to provide a broad and balanced curriculum, particularly in the earlier stages of education. School staff must therefore be able to modify the curriculum to suit a range of learners, to develop a more inclusive curriculum. And it's important to provide pupils with the opportunity to have exam accommodations. I know, Peter, you mentioned this. They must at least be given the option. And I think there's an urgent need to reevaluate the reliance on prompting and task repetition for low-attaining pupils. And we need to start considering alternative explanations for academic failure. If autistic children are not in school, if they're only part-time in school, if they're not accessing the curriculum, if they're not receiving the right support in exams, then perhaps it's unsurprising that they're having difficulties. We do need more research to distinguish flow states from what have been described as negatively experienced compulsions. because very intense interests have been linked negatively with well-being, particularly if they take up too much time. We need empirical research into the concept of monotropism, and we also need research to explore jointly the interests of autistic and non-autistic children. All children are more motivated, independent, persevere more when they're interested and engaged. So perhaps when we learn how to harness positively the very strong interests of autistic children, we can provide lessons for larger school populations. And again, to pick up on something that Peter has said, we urgently need to develop an interest model of communication support and inclusion. The starting point should be a child's strengths and their interests and what motivates them. If you'd like to read some more about this area of my research, I have a paper on this in the Educational Review, and I also had a book published a few weeks ago called Inclusive Education for Autistic Children. The theme of interest comes up in quite a few chapters. Merci beaucoup.